Chapter 1. The Arrival of Lara. The sky was a dull gray, clouds swollen with rain as the road stretched endlessly before Lara. She sat behind the wheel of her old car, the sound of the engine barely audible over the hum of the tires on the damp asphalt. The surrounding countryside seemed empty, with only the occasional tree breaking the monotony of open fields. The air was thick with the smell of rain, a hint of something earthy and old lingering underneath. Lara's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she glanced at the crumpled map on the passenger seat. The route had taken her farther than expected, the lines on the map leading her deeper into unfamiliar territory. Her destination, an isolated village she'd only read about in obscure articles, was just a few miles ahead, though it felt worlds away. The road narrowed as she turned off the main highway, the trees now forming a dense canopy overhead, blocking out what little sunlight remained. Leaves and branches scraped against the sides of the car, the path winding deeper into the woods. The trees loomed over her like silent sentinels, their twisted limbs forming dark shapes in the corners of her vision. She drove slowly, the tires crunching over gravel as the road became uneven. Lara felt a chill creep into the car, colder than the autumn air outside. She rolled up the window, her breath fogging the glass as she exhaled. There was no sound now but the steady hum of the engine and the soft rustle of the wind in the trees. After what felt like hours, the village came into view. It was small, just a scattering of old stone houses clustered around a central square. The buildings were worn with age, their windows dark, roofs sagging as if the weight of time pressed them down. A large, crumbling church stood at the far end of the village, its steeple barely visible through the mist that clung to the ground. Lara parked her car near the edge of the village, the engine falling silent as she stepped out. The air was still, unnaturally quiet, with no signs of life. No birds, no movement, only the soft patter of rain beginning to fall. She pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders and began to walk, her footsteps echoing on the cobblestone streets. Each house she passed felt abandoned, windows black and empty, doorways gaping like open mouths. At the center of the square, a weathered fountain stood, its water long dried up. Lara paused, her eyes drawn to the base of the fountain. Faded carvings of strange symbols covered the stone, their meaning lost to time. She traced a finger over one of them, feeling the rough texture beneath her fingertips. Something about the symbols made her uneasy, though she couldn't place why. She continued walking, the mist thickening around her as she approached the church. Its heavy wooden doors were slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. A broken lantern hung by the entrance, swaying back and forth with a slow, rhythmic motion. The interior of the church was dark, the air inside damp and cold. Lara hesitated at the threshold, her eyes scanning the dim interior. Rows of empty pews stretched out before her, their wood cracked and splintered. The altar at the far end was barely visible in the gloom, covered in dust and cobwebs. Stained glass windows, once vibrant, were now dull and lifeless, their colors muted by grime and age. A single candle sat on the altar, unlit, as if waiting for someone to return. Lara stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath her weight. Her footsteps seemed to echo unnaturally loud in the silence, bouncing off the stone walls. As she moved deeper into the church, she felt a presence, an unshakable sense of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but the doorway remained empty. The village was still, unmoving. She approached the altar, her eyes drawn to a small wooden box that lay at its base. It was covered in dust, but the carvings on its surface were similar to those on the fountain outside. The same strange symbols, etched into the wood with care. Lara knelt down and brushed away the dust, revealing more of the intricate designs. She hesitated for a moment before reaching out to open it. The box creaked as it opened, the sound breaking the heavy silence in the church. Inside, a small, rusted key lay on a bed of dark fabric. Lara picked it up, turning it over in her hand. The metal was cold, rough to the touch, and seemed far older than anything else she had encountered in the village. She felt a strange pull, an urge to know what the key unlocked. As she stood, holding the key tightly, the wind outside picked up, howling through the broken windows of the church. The temperature dropped sharply, and Lara could see her breath in the air. A sense of urgency crept over her, as if time itself was pressing in. She slipped the key into her pocket and hurried back toward the entrance. Outside, the mist had grown denser, swirling around her like a living thing. The village, which had been empty and quiet before, now seemed alive with shadows that moved just out of sight. Lara's pulse quickened as she made her way back to the car. She glanced around, her eyes catching glimpses of movement in the periphery, though nothing was ever there when she looked directly. The car sat where she had left it, but as she reached for the door handle, she noticed something strange. A handprint, smeared on the driver's side window, large and unmistakable. She hadn't noticed it before, and there was no way it had been there when she arrived. The print was too fresh, too deliberate. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the area, the oppressive silence making her every movement feel amplified. There was no one around, no signs of life anywhere. She wiped the print away with her sleeve, the glass now clear but offering no comfort. Lara climbed into the car, her hands trembling slightly as she started the engine. The sound broke the stillness, but the tension in the air remained. She pulled away from the village slowly, her eyes on the road, but in the rearview mirror, she could see the outline of the church, now almost obscured by mist. The village disappeared behind her, swallowed by the fog as she drove back into the woods. The key sat heavy in her pocket, a reminder of what she had found. Something in that village was watching, waiting, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it wasn't done with her yet. Chapter 2. The Unseen Mark. Lara's journey out of the village was slow and uneasy, her mind unable to shake the strange encounter from the crumbling church. The further she drove, the more the fog seemed to thicken, like it was trying to pull her back into the village. The road wound through the dense woods, and the trees pressed in tighter, their gnarled branches reaching over the road like skeletal fingers. The rain had stopped, but the air remained heavy with moisture, clinging to her skin and fogging up the windshield. She glanced at the rearview mirror again, half expecting to see something in the mist behind her. There was nothing, only the blurred shapes of trees and the endless gray. The rusted key in her pocket felt like a lead weight. Lara reached into her coat and pulled it out, holding it up to the dim light filtering through the windshield. It was a simple, old key, the kind that looked like it belonged to a lock that hadn't been opened in decades. As she turned it over in her hand, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. On the shaft of the key was a small engraving, almost invisible beneath the rust. Lara squinted, running her thumb over it. The symbol was familiar, though she couldn't place why. It was the same design she had seen on the fountain in the village and on the box inside the church. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the connection. Distracted by the key, Lara barely noticed the road ahead of her until the car hit something hard. The steering wheel jerked violently in her hands, and the car lurched to the side, skidding to a stop on the gravel shoulder. Her heart raced as she gripped the wheel, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. For a moment, everything was still, the only sound the distant rustle of the wind in the trees. She slowly got out of the car, her legs shaky beneath her. The mist was thicker here, swirling around her ankles as she moved to the front of the vehicle. There, lodged under the front tire, was a large, jagged stone, half buried in the gravel. The impact had bent the front bumper, and one of the headlights flickered weakly before going out completely. Lara sighed, her breath visible in the cool air, and kicked the stone out of the way. As she stood up, brushing the dirt off her hands, something caught her eye on the side of the road. A small, faded sign, half covered by overgrown vines and weeds. She walked over to it, pushing aside the leaves to reveal the worn words beneath, "Property of St. Nathaniel's Asylum." The name sent a shiver through her, though she didn't know why. She hadn't heard of any asylum nearby, but then again, this area seemed full of forgotten places. The road stretched on into the mist, and for a moment, Lara debated whether to turn back or keep going. Her instincts told her to leave, to drive as far from this place as she could, but the key in her pocket seemed to pull her in the opposite direction. With a reluctant sigh, she climbed back into the car, started the engine, and continued down the road. The way forward grew narrower, the gravel giving way to dirt as she went deeper into the woods. The trees seemed to close in even more, their branches tangling overhead, blocking out the sky completely. It felt as though she was driving into a tunnel made of living things, and the further she went, the darker it became. After what felt like an eternity, the outline of a large building emerged from the fog. It sat on a hill, towering over the trees, its silhouette dark and imposing against the gray sky. St. Nathaniel's Asylum. The building was old, its stone walls covered in creeping vines and moss, its windows broken and black like empty eyes staring down at her. Lara parked the car at the edge of the property, hesitating for a moment before stepping out. The air here was different, thicker, almost suffocating, with a faint, acrid smell that stung her nose. She looked around, but there were no signs of life, no birds, no animals. Even the trees seemed lifeless, their leaves brown and brittle despite the damp air. The gate to the asylum was slightly ajar, its rusted hinges groaning as the wind pushed it back and forth. Lara walked toward it, her boots crunching over the gravel, and pushed the gate open the rest of the way. The path leading to the main entrance was overgrown with weeds and cracked stone, and as she approached the doors, she noticed something strange. A symbol etched into the heavy wooden door, the same symbol that was on the key. She stood there for a moment, staring at the door, her mind racing with questions. Why had she found this key? What was it meant to unlock? And why did everything seem connected to that village? Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The inside of the asylum was dark, the air cold and stale. Dust covered every surface, and the walls were lined with peeling, faded wallpaper. The smell of mold and decay filled her nostrils as she stepped inside, her footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the cavernous space. The main hall stretched out before her, long and narrow, with doors lining both sides. Most of them were closed, but a few were slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of empty rooms filled with old furniture and debris. At the far end of the hall was a staircase, its banisters splintered and worn. The stairs led up to the second floor, where the darkness seemed to grow even thicker. Lara's hand tightened around the key in her pocket as she walked down the hall. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger now. Like unseen eyes followed her every movement. She quickened her pace, her boots making dull thuds against the wooden floor. A door on her right caught her attention. It was different from the others. Smaller, with a heavy iron lock that looked out of place in the decrepit building. She took out the key, her fingers trembling slightly as she fitted into the lock. It turned with a loud click, and the door creaked open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, its walls covered in faded medical charts and old photographs. At the center of the room was a large wooden desk, and on it, an open book. The book's pages were yellowed with age, and as Lara approached, she saw that the words had been scrawled hastily, some of them barely legible. But it wasn't the writing that caught her attention, it was the photographs. They were pinned to the wall above the desk, each one showing patients of the asylum, their faces twisted in fear or madness. And at the center of them all, in every photograph, was the same symbol, drawn on their foreheads in dark ink. Lara's heart raced as she stared at the images. She didn't understand what any of it meant, but she knew one thing. Something terrible had happened here, something that had been hidden away for a long time. And whatever it was, she was now a part of it. As she turned to leave, a sharp pain shot through her chest. She gasped, clutching at her shirt, and when she pulled her hand away, she saw it. There, on her palm, was the mark. The same symbol, dark and unmistakable, now etched into her skin like a brand. Panic flooded her, and she stumbled out of the room, her vision blurring as the walls seemed to close in around her. She had to get out. She had to leave this place. But even as she rushed toward the exit, the weight of the key in her pocket felt heavier than ever, pulling her deeper into the mystery she couldn't escape. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Fog. Lara's breaths were shallow as she sped down the narrow road, the asylum shrinking behind her in the rearview mirror. The weight of what had happened inside gnawed at her thoughts. The mark on her palm felt like it was burning, though when she glanced down at it, the dark symbol remained still. She tried rubbing it away, but the mark seemed permanent, etched deep into her skin. The further she drove, the more her thoughts spiraled, pulling her back to the strange photographs, the eerie key, and the chilling silence of the asylum. The road seemed endless, winding through the dense forest. Trees towered on either side, their gnarled branches casting shadows that danced across the hood of her car. The fog hung low, swirling around the road like a living thing, growing denser the deeper she went. Even the headlights struggled to pierce through the thick mist, leaving only a few feet of visibility ahead. Lara's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the road narrowed. The woods here felt different, the trees older, the air heavier. Every sound, the crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves, seemed amplified, though there was no wind. The oppressive silence wrapped around her, pressing in from all sides. Her hands trembled slightly as she steered the car around a sharp bend, her heart racing with each mile. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away from the asylum. The key, still in her pocket, felt heavier with every passing minute. Lara's eyes flicked between the road and the rearview mirror, her mind playing tricks on her, imagining shapes shifting in the fog behind her. Shadows seemed to move in the trees, but whenever she looked directly at them, there was nothing. A sudden sharp movement caught her attention, a figure darting across the road just ahead of her. Lara slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car swerved to a halt. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sat frozen, gripping the steering wheel. The figure had disappeared into the fog, but she was certain she had seen something, a person, or at least something resembling one. For a moment, she debated whether to get out and investigate, but the thought sent a chill down her spine. Instead, she kept her eyes fixed on the spot where the figure had crossed, waiting for any sign of movement. The fog shifted, thick and swirling, but the road ahead remained empty. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm her nerves, and pressed the gas pedal. The car crept forward, the road narrowing even further as the trees seemed to close in around her. The shadows returned, flickering at the edges of her vision, but she forced herself to focus on the path ahead. As she drove, a strange sensation settled over her, a feeling of being followed, of something watching her from just beyond the reach of the headlights. Her pulse quickened, and her skin prickled with a cold sweat. The road twisted through the woods, the curves sharp and unpredictable. Each turn felt like a descent deeper into a place that shouldn't exist, a place that was pulling her in with no way out. Her headlights suddenly caught the outline of something on the side of the road. Lara slowed the car and squinted through the windshield, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. A small wooden sign stood crooked at the edge of the road, barely visible in the fog. The lettering was faded, but as she drove closer, she could make out the words, Black Hollow. She had never heard of the place, but something about the name struck her with a sense of foreboding. The road continued to wind ahead, but the mist seemed to grow even thicker, almost as if it were drawing her toward this new, unknown destination. The trees here were older, their trunks twisted and gnarled, like ancient sentinels guarding a forgotten secret. Every instinct told her to turn back, to leave this place before she was in too deep. But the pull of the unknown kept her moving forward. Lara's car rolled into the clearing, where a dilapidated signpost marked the entrance to what appeared to be a long-abandoned village. Black Hollow was carved into the post, the letters chipped and worn, barely legible under the creeping vines that had overtaken the wood. Beyond the sign lay a scattering of buildings, small cottages with sagging roofs, their windows shattered and doors hanging open. The village was silent, devoid of any life. swallowed by the thick fog that curled around the ruins like an oppressive shroud. She parked the car and stepped out, her boots sinking into the soft, damp earth. The air here was thick with decay, the scent of rotting wood and wet leaves filling her lungs as she took a hesitant step forward. The fog swirled around her feet, moving in slow, deliberate curls as if it were alive. The village was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint creak of wood and the distant rustle of leaves. Lara walked toward the nearest house, her footsteps muted on the moss-covered ground. The house, like the others, was barely standing. Its walls were crumbling, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. She pushed it open gently, and it groaned as it swung inward, revealing the dark interior. Inside, everything was in disarray. Broken furniture, old blankets, and scattered debris covered the floor. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols scratched into the wood, similar to the ones she had seen in the asylum. She shivered as she moved deeper into the house, her eyes drawn to a small table in the corner. On it sat an old book, its cover worn and faded, the pages yellowed with age. The same symbol was etched into the leather, the strange design now all too familiar. She reached out and touched it, her fingers brushing over the rough surface, and a jolt of fear shot through her. The house felt wrong, like it was holding something back, something that wanted to be let loose. Lara turned and hurried out of the building, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced around the village, taking in the other structures, all in similar states of ruin, all marked with the same mysterious symbols. As she made her way back to the car, something caught her eye. At the far end of the village, partially obscured by fog, stood a large stone well. It looked ancient, its edges worn smooth by time and weather. Lara approached cautiously, drawn by an unseen force, her footsteps barely making a sound as she moved through the thick mist. The well was deeper than it appeared, the darkness inside swallowing her gaze as she peered over the edge. There was something unsettling about it, something that made her heart race even though she couldn't explain why. A chill ran down her spine as she backed away, the fog swirling around her like a living thing. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the village, the sound reverberating off the stone walls. Lara spun around, her eyes scanning the empty streets, but there was no one in sight. The fog shifted, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement, a dark shape flitting between the buildings, just out of reach of her vision. Her pulse quickened, and she rushed back to the car, the weight of the key in her pocket growing heavier with each step. The air felt charged, like the village itself was watching her, waiting for something. As she started the car and drove away, the shadows in the fog seemed to move with her, trailing just behind the car, always just out of sight. The road wound back through the trees, the village disappearing behind her, swallowed by the mist. But even as she left Black Hollow behind, the feeling of being followed didn't fade. The fog clung to the car like a shadow, and the mark on her palm pulsed with a dull, persistent ache. Lara drove on, deeper into the unknown, her mind spinning with questions she had no answers for. The key, the mark, the asylum, the village, they were all connected. But how? And why was she at the center of it all? She didn't know, but one thing was clear. Whatever had started back at the village wasn't finished with her yet. Chapter 4. The Soundless Chase. The road was a black ribbon under the oppressive fog, winding endlessly as Lara drove deeper into the unknown. The dense mist still clung to the car, swirling around her like a ghostly presence. The sky above had darkened considerably, giving way to the kind of overcast that blurred the lines between day and night. The faint outline of the sun, obscured behind thick clouds, offered no comfort as she pressed on. The mark on her palm pulsed again, an aching reminder of the strange force binding her to this place. Every now and then, she would glance at it, her fingers brushing the skin, feeling the etched lines as if they were scars rather than markings. The weight of the key in her pocket seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, as if it were tethered to something in the fog, pulling her toward an inevitable fate. The trees, tall and ancient, leaned over the road as though they were closing in, their gnarled branches twisted into shapes that resembled reaching hands, waiting to snatch anything that dared to pass beneath them. Even through the closed windows of the car, Lara could feel the weight of their silent presence. It was as though the forest was alive, watching her every move, tracking her with unseen eyes. Suddenly, the road ahead split into two. The signs were rusted, their lettering barely visible, but Lara could make out two choices: Westbrook to the left and Highland Ridge to the right. Neither name meant anything to her, but a deep sense of dread filled her chest as she sat at the fork, staring down both paths. Each road seemed to stretch into an abyss of fog, promising nothing but uncertainty. Lara hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding. The mist coiled around the car as if urging her to decide. She turned right, toward Highland Ridge, the road narrowing immediately as she made the turn. The trees grew denser, the shadows between them darker and more menacing. The fog, once thick and swirling, seemed to part slightly, giving way to glimpses of the twisted landscape beyond. Her foot pressed harder on the accelerator, speeding through the unfamiliar terrain. The tires crunched over the gravel, the sound eerily muffled by the oppressive mist. She checked the rearview mirror again, and for a fleeting moment, she swore she saw something, or someone, following her. A shadow, indistinct and shapeless, moving within the fog. Her pulse quickened, and she looked back toward the road, gripping the wheel tighter. The uneasy silence of the forest seemed to hum with tension, the weight of the atmosphere pressing in on all sides. Every now and then, the wind would stir the branches, causing them to creak ominously. But still, Lara couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something alive in the mist, stalking her just out of sight. She glanced into the rearview mirror again. The shadow was gone, but her heart wouldn't settle. Her knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as she leaned forward, her eyes scanning the road ahead, her body tense as though ready to bolt at any moment. The road continued to wind through the dense trees, and she couldn't tell if she was moving forward or simply circling back into the same stretch of forest over and over. Then, the car's engine sputtered. Lara's heart sank as the car jerked violently, the engine coughing before it gave out entirely. She rolled to a stop in the middle of the narrow road, the silence that followed deafening. The only sound was the soft ticking of the cooling engine, the faint crackle of the radio struggling to pick up a signal through the static. She sat in the stillness for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel, her breath shallow. The fog curled around the car like a predator, waiting for her next move. Lara leaned back in her seat, exhaling shakily. She knew she couldn't stay here, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with whatever was lurking in the shadows. With a deep breath, she opened the car door. The air outside was colder than she expected, biting against her skin as she stepped out onto the gravel. The fog seemed thicker now, swallowing everything in its path. Lara stood beside the car, surveying her surroundings. The trees towered above her, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching toward the sky. The mist muffled every sound, turning the forest into an echoing void. She popped the hood of the car, the metal still warm to the touch as she leaned over to inspect the engine. Her mechanical knowledge was limited, but she could tell something was wrong. A belt had snapped, and the radiator was leaking. It wasn't something she could fix here, not without tools. She closed the hood and leaned against the car, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts as the reality of her situation sank in. She was stranded. Lara scanned the road in both directions. To her left, the road curved deeper into the fog, disappearing into the woods. To her right, the fork she had passed earlier was nowhere to be seen, swallowed by the mist. There was no way of knowing how far she had come, or how far she still had to go. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, barely visible through the fog, standing at the edge of the trees. It was human-shaped, but its outline was distorted, as if the mist itself was clinging to its form. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching her with an intensity that sent chills down her spine. Lara's breath caught in her throat. She backed away from the car slowly, her eyes locked on the figure. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound of her pulse filling her ears. The figure remained motionless, but there was something inherently wrong about it, something unnatural. She turned and started walking briskly down the road, away from the car, away from the figure. Her footsteps were muffled by the fog, each step feeling heavier than the last. The figure didn't follow, but she could feel its presence, lingering behind her, watching her every move. The road stretched on endlessly, the fog growing thicker as she moved further away from the car. Lara's mind raced with questions, but she couldn't afford to stop. Not with the figure still standing in the distance, not with the feeling of being hunted growing stronger with each passing second. Then she heard it, the faint sound of footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate, growing louder with each step. Her heart leapt into her throat as she quickened her pace, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The footsteps followed, keeping pace with her, growing louder, closer. Lara broke into a run. The road seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the fog swallowing everything in its path. She ran faster, her legs burning, her lungs aching for air. The sound of footsteps grew louder, matching her pace, as if whatever was following her was just inches behind. She dared not look back, knowing that if she did, the figure would be right there, waiting to consume her. Her feet pounded against the gravel, the sound of her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The fog thickened, wrapping around her like a shroud, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Every step felt heavier, every breath more labored, but she couldn't stop. Not now, not with the thing closing in behind her. Suddenly, the ground beneath her gave way. Lara's foot slipped, and she tumbled down an embankment, her body rolling over rocks and debris as she crashed to the bottom. Pain shot through her as she came to a stop, her vision swimming from the impact. The world tilted around her, and for a moment, she lay still, gasping for breath. The footsteps had stopped. She sat up slowly, her body aching from the fall. The fog still clung to the air around her, but the road was gone, replaced by a dense thicket of trees and brambles. She had fallen off the path, lost in the depths of the forest. The shadows around her seemed to shift, moving in ways that made her stomach churn. Lara struggled to her feet, wincing as she put weight on her ankle. She was alone now, surrounded by the thick, ancient woods, with no clear way back. The fog curled around her, silent and suffocating, as if the forest itself was alive and breathing. And somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint echo of footsteps, growing closer again, one deliberate step at a time. Chapter 5. Into the Abyss. Lara's breath came in ragged gasps as she limped through the forest, her ankle throbbing with each step. The ground beneath her was uneven, a mixture of damp leaves, roots, and stones that made every movement uncertain. The fog, thick as ever, clung to the air around her, swallowing up the landscape, erasing the horizon. It was as though she had been cast into an endless void, and the only thing keeping her grounded was the pain in her leg. The eerie silence that had surrounded her earlier was broken only by the distant crunch of footsteps echoing through the mist. They weren't fast, but they were steady, persistent, always just far enough behind to remind her she wasn't alone. The unseen pursuer kept its distance, never rushing but never ceasing, as if it had all the time in the world to close the gap. Lara pushed on, forcing her way through the underbrush, her fingers brushing against wet leaves and thorny branches that tugged at her clothes and scratched her skin. The trees seemed to loom over her now, their twisted shapes forming unnatural shadows in the fog. Every now and then, the wind would stir, causing the branches to creak and groan, making the forest feel more like a living entity than a mere collection of trees. She stumbled, catching herself against the rough bark of a nearby tree, her hand pressing against the ancient wood. The texture was strange, almost like skin, and she recoiled instinctively, wiping her hand on her jeans. She glanced back, half expecting to see the figure emerging from the mist, but there was nothing, just the faint whisper of the forest and the soft crackle of unseen footsteps. With a deep breath, Lara pressed on. The terrain grew steeper, the trees denser, and the ground wetter as she descended further into the heart of the forest. Her ankle screamed with every step, but she couldn't stop. Not here, not with the shadow of the unknown so close behind. She focused on the narrow path in front of her, one foot in front of the other, her body moving on autopilot even as her mind raced with panic. The trees began to thin out slightly, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw the faintest glow of light through the fog. Her heart leapt with hope, and she quickened her pace, hobbling forward with renewed energy. The light grew stronger as she neared, breaking through the thick mist like a beacon. Suddenly, she emerged into a small clearing. At the center of the clearing was a solitary structure, an old, crumbling cabin, its wooden walls weathered and decayed by time. Moss clung to the roof, and vines snaked up the sides, wrapping around the door like twisted ropes. The windows were dark, shattered in places, and the entire building seemed to sag under the weight of years of neglect. It was as if the forest had tried to reclaim the cabin, pulling it back into the earth, but had not yet succeeded. Lara hesitated, standing at the edge of the clearing, her eyes fixed on the cabin. The sight of it sent a chill down her spine, but the pain in her ankle and the relentless footsteps behind her left her with no choice. She couldn't keep running, not without rest, not without finding some kind of shelter. The clearing was eerily quiet. The footsteps that had haunted her had fallen silent, but she could still feel that presence, lurking somewhere in the fog just beyond the trees. Taking a deep breath, she limped toward the cabin, each step feeling heavier than the last. The door, slightly ajar, creaked as she pushed it open. The interior was dark, the only light filtering in through the broken windows. Dust hung in the air, illuminated by the weak shafts of light that pierced the gloom. Inside, the cabin was empty, save for a few pieces of old, rotting furniture. A chair with one leg missing, a wooden table with deep scratches gouged into the surface, and a fireplace filled with charred remains of wood that hadn't been touched in years. Lara closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her body shaking with exhaustion. The cabin's silence was oppressive, but it was a different kind of silence than the forest outside. It felt heavier, as though the air inside had been thickened by time and memory. She took a few tentative steps forward, her eyes scanning the room for anything useful, any sign that this place had once been lived in. There was nothing but dust and decay. She made her way to the table, her fingers tracing the deep grooves in the wood. The markings were strange, like symbols or runes, carved with precision but weathered by time. They meant nothing to her, but the sight of them filled her with unease. She looked away, focusing instead on the fireplace. The ashes were old, long dead, but something about the space felt wrong. The hearth, though covered in soot, seemed too clean, as if it had been used for something more than warmth. Lara moved toward the fireplace, her gaze falling to the floor just in front of it. The floorboards were uneven, some of them cracked, and as she stepped closer, she noticed one of them was loose. Kneeling down, she pried the board up with her hands, revealing a small, hidden compartment underneath. Inside, wrapped in old, tattered cloth, was an object. She hesitated for a moment before reaching in to pull it out. The cloth disintegrated in her hands, and what remained was a small, ornate box made of dark wood, its surface etched with the same strange symbols as the table. The box was cold to the touch, unnaturally so, as though it had been sitting in a place far removed from the warmth of the earth. Lara sat back on her heels, staring at the box. Something about it felt important, as if it were connected to everything. The fog, the footsteps, the strange force that had marked her hand. She could feel the weight of it in her palm, not just physical but something deeper, something that resonated with the same eerie pull she had felt ever since she arrived in this place. The fog outside pressed against the windows, swirling and pulsing, as though alive and waiting for her to make her next move. Lara placed the box on the table and stepped back, unsure of what to do. She couldn't shake the feeling that opening it would unleash something that had been sealed away for a reason. But the pull was strong, almost too strong to resist. As she stood there, her hand unconsciously moving toward the box, a sound broke through the silence. A soft creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. But this time, they weren't outside. They were inside. Lara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound came from the back of the cabin, where the shadows were thickest, near the closed door that led deeper into the structure. The air grew colder, and she could feel a presence, something or someone, standing just beyond the reach of the dim light. Her breath caught in her throat as the footsteps drew closer, deliberate and slow. The cabin groaned under the weight of it, the wooden floor creaking with each step. She backed away, her gaze fixed on the darkness, trying to make out the shape of whatever was approaching. The door at the back of the cabin opened slowly, its hinges squealing in protest. From the depths of the shadowed room, something began to emerge. A figure, draped in fog and darkness, its form indistinct but undeniably human. The air grew impossibly cold, and Lara could see her breath in front of her as she took a step back. The figure moved closer, its footsteps heavy and slow, echoing in the confined space. Lara's mind raced, but there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. She was trapped in the cabin, with only the ancient box between her and the thing that was coming for her. The fog pressed against the windows, and the footsteps continued, growing louder as the figure drew nearer. And then, the floor beneath her feet shifted. Lara stumbled, her hands reaching out to steady herself, but the floorboards gave way beneath her, and she fell. There was no time to scream, no time to react as the ground opened up and swallowed her whole. Darkness closed in around her, the world above disappearing in an instant as she plummeted into the abyss. The cold air rushed past her, the distant echo of footsteps growing fainter and fainter until there was nothing but silence. And then, the darkness swallowed her completely. Chapter 6. Beneath the surface. The fall seemed endless. Lara's body tumbled through the air, weightless in the dark void that surrounded her. Her arms flailed, searching for something to grab hold of, but there was nothing. Only the sensation of plummeting further and further into the unknown. The cold wind rushed past her ears, but beyond that, there was only silence. An oppressive silence that felt like it would consume her along with the blackness. Finally, with a bone-jarring thud, she hit the ground. The impact sent a wave of pain through her body, knocking the breath from her lungs. She lay there for a moment, dazed and disoriented. Her limbs splayed awkwardly on the cold, hard surface beneath her. It took several agonizing seconds for her to realize that she was no longer falling. The ground beneath her was solid, but damp and cold, the kind of cold that seeped into her bones. Slowly, painfully, Lara pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, her whole body trembling from the effort. Her ankle throbbed, worse now from the fall, and her muscles screamed in protest as she forced herself to stand. She was in some kind of cavern, a hollowed-out chamber deep beneath the surface. The walls of the cave were rough and jagged, glistening faintly with moisture in the dim light that filtered down from somewhere far above. High above, the faint outline of the hole she had fallen through was barely visible, a distant circle of pale light surrounded by the inky blackness of the cavern walls. But there was no way back up. The walls were too steep, too smooth, and the hole too far out of reach. Lara was trapped down here, deep in the bowels of the earth. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The floor of the cavern was uneven, a mix of loose rocks and hard-packed earth. The air was damp, and the smell of wet stone and decay clung to the back of her throat. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the cavern, adding to the unsettling stillness. Lara limped forward, each step sending sharp pangs of pain through her injured ankle. The shadows moved with her, shifting and swirling as her eyes struggled to make sense of her surroundings. There was something unnatural about the way the darkness clung to the edges of the cavern, as though it had a life of its own, breathing and pulsing like a living thing. The farther she moved into the cave, the more she realized how vast it was. It stretched on for what seemed like miles, the ceiling rising and falling in irregular patterns, creating strange shapes in the shadows. The cavern's vastness made it feel as though she had stepped into another world, an ancient, forgotten place that had never seen the light of day. Suddenly, Lara's foot caught on something hard, and she stumbled, nearly falling again. She caught herself just in time and looked down to see what had tripped her. Half buried in the dirt was an old, rusted chain, thick and heavy, its links twisted and broken in places. It led further into the darkness, disappearing into the shadows where the cave walls narrowed. Without thinking, she followed it. The chain seemed to pull her forward, as if it were leading her deeper into the heart of the cavern. She limped along its path, her breath shallow and ragged in the cold, stale air. Her hands brushed against the rough walls, feeling their strange texture, almost as though they had been carved by something or someone. As she walked, the atmosphere around her changed. The air grew colder, and the faint sound of dripping water became more pronounced. She could see it now, small rivulets of water running down the walls in strange patterns, forming pools on the cavern floor. The water was dark, reflecting nothing but the shadows around it. And then, she saw it. Ahead of her, at the far end of the cavern, was a structure. It stood in stark contrast to the natural rock formations, its presence wholly unnatural. Made of dark stone and weathered by time, the structure was massive, resembling some kind of ancient altar or monument. Its surface was covered in the same strange symbols she had seen in the cabin above, etched deeply into the stone as though they held some long-forgotten meaning. The chain she had been following ended here, coiling around the base of the structure like a serpent. Lara stopped in front of it, her breath catching in her throat. The air around the monument was different, thicker, heavier, as if it carried the weight of centuries of secrets. Without thinking, Lara stepped closer to the structure, her eyes drawn to the center of the altar. There, nestled in a hollowed-out cavity, was something that looked like an object, a small, polished stone or gem, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The glow was soft but persistent, casting long shadows across the cavern floor. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the surface of the stone. The moment she touched it, a cold shock shot through her body, freezing her in place. Her mind was flooded with images, dark, twisted visions of things she couldn't comprehend. Faces, distorted and monstrous, flashed before her eyes, mouths open in silent screams. She saw places, ancient, forgotten places, buried deep beneath the earth, where the walls whispered secrets and the ground wept blood. She tried to pull her hand away, but the stone held her in its grip, its cold presence burrowing into her mind. The visions grew more intense, more horrific. The faces twisted, melting into grotesque forms, their eyes empty and hollow. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo from the very walls of the cavern. Lara's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She felt as though she was drowning in the darkness, the weight of the visions pressing down on her, suffocating her. She could feel the presence of something ancient, something malevolent, lurking just beyond the edge of her consciousness, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the vision stopped. Lara jerked her hand away from the stone, gasping for air. The cavern was silent once more, the shadows still, but the memory of what she had seen lingered in her mind, a dark stain she couldn't wash away. She staggered back from the altar, her heart still racing, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She knew now that the thing she had uncovered was not meant to be found. Whatever power the stone held, it was ancient and dangerous, and she had disturbed it. The cavern itself seemed to hum with energy, as though it had been awoken by her presence. The walls seemed to close in around her, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing moment. Lara took one last look at the altar, the strange glow from the stone pulsing faintly in the darkness. She knew she couldn't stay here any longer. She had to leave, had to get as far away from this place as possible. But as she turned to leave, something shifted in the darkness behind her. The ground trembled beneath her feet, and the sound of stone grinding against stone echoed through the cavern. Lara froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she slowly turned to face whatever was coming. From the shadows, something massive began to emerge, a figure, tall and imposing, its shape indistinct in the gloom. It moved slowly, deliberately, its footsteps heavy and echoing through the chamber. The ground trembled with each step it took, the chains rattling softly as the figure moved closer to the altar. Lara backed away, her heart racing, but there was nowhere to go. The walls of the cavern loomed around her, and the dark figure continued its approach, its eyes, if it had any, fixed on her. The presence she had felt earlier, The ancient, malevolent force was here now, fully awake, and it was coming for her. As the figure stepped into the faint glow of the altar, Lara saw its form, twisted and grotesque, like something born from the very nightmares she had witnessed. It towered over her, its body draped in shadows and mist, its features indistinguishable but terrifying nonetheless. And then, without warning, the cavern floor gave way beneath her feet once more. The ground opened up, swallowing her in an instant, and she plunged into the darkness again, her body falling deeper into the abyss, and the figure watched her disappear, its eyes gleaming faintly in the dim light, before it vanished back into the shadows. Chapter 7. The Abyss Below. Lara fell through the void once more, the darkness pressing in around her as she spiraled downward. She had no sense of time or direction, her body weightless in the blackness that swallowed her whole. The cold air bit at her skin, sharp as ice, but her mind was numb, lost in the endless plunge. Then, with a sickening thud, she landed. Pain shot through her body, but it was dull, distant, as though her nerves were too shocked to register it fully. She lay still for a moment, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The fall had winded her, but nothing seemed broken. She blinked up at the ceiling above, but there was nothing to see, only darkness. Slowly, painfully, Lara rolled onto her side and sat up. Her body ached in every joint, and the bruises from her previous fall had only worsened. She gingerly touched her ankle, which throbbed with pain, swollen and tender from the strain. Each breath was shallow, labored, as though the weight of the cavern itself pressed down on her chest. She took a moment to collect herself, scanning her surroundings. The space she had landed in was smaller than the previous cavern, the walls close and rough. The air was stifling, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. There was no sound here, not even the distant dripping of water she had heard before. The silence was suffocating, wrapping around her like a heavy shroud. The ground beneath her was uneven, littered with rocks and debris. As she struggled to her feet, the uneven terrain shifted under her weight, sending small stones skittering across the floor. The cold bit through her clothes, the dampness in the air clinging to her skin like an unwelcome second layer. Once standing, she limped forward, the pain in her ankle making each step an ordeal. Her breath came in sharp bursts, the sound of her own movement the only noise breaking the oppressive silence. As she moved, her foot brushed against something soft. She froze, glancing down to see what it was. A pile of bones lay scattered across the floor, human bones, bleached white and broken, arranged haphazardly. The sight sent a chill down her spine, a deep, instinctive fear that clawed at her chest. She knelt down, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch one of the skulls, its hollow eye sockets staring back at her. Who had they been? How had they ended up down here? Her hand recoiled at the touch of the cold, brittle bone. She stood again, her heart pounding in her chest. The bones were not old. There was still some trace of clothing, fabric worn and tattered by time, but unmistakably modern. Whoever these people had been, they had been trapped here, just like her. Lara tore her gaze away from the remains and forced herself to keep moving. The cavern seemed to stretch on endlessly, each step a painful reminder of her injuries. The darkness was total, broken only by the faintest glow of phosphorescent lichen that clung to the walls in patches, providing just enough light for her to see the path ahead. The deeper she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls felt like they were closing in, narrowing as the cavern twisted and turned, forcing her to squeeze through tight gaps and duck under low-hanging rock formations. The air grew colder still, and with it came a sense of dread that gnawed at the edges of her mind. She stumbled once more, this time tripping over a rock embedded in the dirt. She caught herself before she could fall, but as she stood, something caught her eye, a faint glimmer in the distance. It was barely noticeable, just a flicker of light in the corner of her vision, but it was there. Lara limped toward it, her steps quickening despite the pain. As she drew closer, the light grew stronger, though its source remained hidden in the shadows. It was unnatural, different from the soft glow of the lichen, a steady, pulsing light that seemed to beckon her forward. The cavern opened up into another chamber, smaller but more ominous than the others. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, much like the altar she had seen earlier, though this one was smaller and cruder in design. Upon it rested an object, a black, polished stone, glowing faintly with that same eerie light. Her heart sank at the sight of it. Another stone, another artifact. She instinctively recoiled, remembering the horrors she had witnessed when she had touched the previous one. But something was different about this stone. The glow was weaker, more subdued, as though whatever force it held had been drained or diminished. Lara hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, to leave this cursed place behind. But where would she go? The cavern was a labyrinth, and the way out was lost to her now. She had no choice but to confront whatever lay ahead. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, approaching the pedestal. Her hand hovered over the stone, trembling with fear and anticipation. Slowly, cautiously, she lowered her fingers until they brushed against the surface. There was no immediate shock, no flood of visions like before. Instead, the stone remained cold and lifeless under her touch, its glow flickering faintly, as if it were barely clinging to life. Lara exhaled in relief, but kept her hand on the stone, feeling its smooth surface. Suddenly, the room trembled. The ground beneath her shook violently, causing her to stumble back, nearly losing her footing. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling, and the walls groaned as though they were about to collapse. Lara's heart raced as she looked around in panic, but the source of the tremor became apparent within moments. From the shadows of the chamber, figures began to emerge. At first, they were just shapes, indistinct and blurred by the darkness, but as they drew closer, their forms took shape. They were human, or had been, once. Their bodies were emaciated, their skin stretched tight over bone, their eyes hollow and lifeless. Their mouths hung open, as if in eternal, silent screams. Lara stepped back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The figures moved slowly, their skeletal limbs creaking and groaning with each step. They reached out toward her, their bony fingers grasping at the air, as if they were trying to pull her into their cursed existence. She backed away, her body trembling with fear. The figures closed in, surrounding her. Their hollow eyes locked onto her with a hunger that sent chills down her spine. They moved with a deliberate slowness, as though they had all the time in the world to claim her. In a moment of blind terror, Lara turned and fled. She ran through the twisting caverns, the pain in her ankle forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. The figures pursued her, their footsteps a slow, rhythmic shuffle, but their presence was suffocating, growing closer with each passing second. The walls of the cavern blurred as she ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The glow of the lichen flickered in and out of her vision, offering fleeting glimpses of the path ahead. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away from those things. Her heart pounded in her chest, her legs burning with exhaustion, but she pushed herself forward, not daring to look back. The sound of the shuffling figures echoed through the cavern, always just behind her, relentless in their pursuit. Just when Lara thought she could run no further, the cavern opened up into a wide, empty chamber. She stumbled to a stop, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. The figures were gone. No more shuffling footsteps, no more skeletal hands reaching out to drag her down. The room was silent. In the center of the chamber stood another stone pedestal, but this one was different. It was taller, more ornate, with intricate carvings etched into its surface. On top of it rested a large, gleaming stone. Larger than the others, its surface flawless and black as night. Lara stared at it, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. She knew, deep down, that this was the source of everything. The darkness, the visions, the figures that had pursued her. This stone held the key to whatever nightmare she had stumbled into. But to take it meant risking everything. Lara took a hesitant step forward, her mind torn between the need to escape and the fear of what this stone could do. The chamber seemed to hold its breath as she approached the pedestal, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. And then, with a final surge of determination, She reached out and grasped the stone. The world went black. Chapter 8. The Descent. Lara awoke in darkness once again. Her body was splayed out on cold, damp stone, every muscle aching, her skin tingling with the memory of the stone she had touched. For a moment, she didn't know where she was, or even who she was. Her mind was clouded with confusion and fear. As the haze lifted, she sat up slowly, her bones creaking as if they had aged decades in the blink of an eye. Her breath formed small clouds in the air, the temperature having plummeted even further than before. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart, and then looked around. The chamber she was in now was unlike anything she had seen before. The walls were jagged and lined with thick, unnatural veins of glowing red. They pulsed faintly, as if alive, casting a dim, eerie light over the cavern. It felt like the heart of something vast and terrible, the walls seeming to pulse in rhythm with the beat of her own heart. The floor beneath her was slick and wet, covered in a thin layer of moisture. It smelled of rust and decay, the thick scent of blood hanging in the air like a dense fog. Lara's stomach churned, but she forced herself to stand, the pain in her ankle flaring up again as she put weight on it. She looked behind her, but the way she had come was gone. The cavern had shifted once more, sealing off her escape. There was no going back now. She was trapped deeper than ever, with only one way forward, downward. A narrow staircase, hewn roughly from the rock, spiraled down into the earth. It was steep, uneven, and wet, each step coated in a slick layer of slime that made every movement perilous. The steps seemed to stretch on forever, disappearing into the inky blackness below. Lara hesitated at the top of the staircase, her body trembling with fear. She knew she had no choice but to descend, yet every instinct screamed at her to turn back, to find another way. But there was no other way. Her path was set, and all that lay ahead was the unknown. She began her descent slowly, gripping the walls of the cavern for support. The rock was cold and slimy beneath her fingertips, but it was the only thing keeping her steady as she made her way down the treacherous stairs. Her breath was shallow and rapid, the sound of her own breathing the only noise in the oppressive silence. Each step felt like a lifetime. The darkness was absolute, the red glow from the veins in the walls barely enough to illuminate the next few steps. The cavern was silent, save for the faint sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance. It was a maddening sound, irregular and echoing, each drop reminding her how far she was from the surface. As she descended, Lara's mind began to wander. The further she went, the more disconnected she felt from the world above. Memories of her life before this nightmare were growing distant, fading into a fog that seemed to envelop her thoughts. She tried to hold on to them, tried to remember who she was, where she had come from, but it was as if the darkness was slowly swallowing her identity whole. The staircase wound on, spiraling deeper and deeper into the earth. The air grew thicker, heavier, making each breath a struggle. The temperature continued to drop, the cold seeping into her bones. Her limbs felt sluggish, as though the very air around her was weighing her down. She paused for a moment, leaning against the wall to catch her breath. Her ankle throbbed painfully, and she could feel the swelling getting worse with each passing minute. But there was no time to rest. She had to keep moving. With a grimace, she forced herself to continue, each step sending a sharp jolt of pain up her leg. The staircase grew steeper the further she went, the steps narrower and more uneven. The red glow in the walls flickered, growing dimmer, as if the life force that powered it was slowly fading away. After what felt like hours, Lara finally reached the bottom. The staircase ended abruptly in a large, open cavern. The floor was flat, the walls towering high above her, disappearing into the darkness. In the center of the cavern was a massive, circular pit, its edges jagged and uneven, as though it had been ripped open by some violent force. The pit was impossibly deep. The faint red light from the veins barely illuminated the top of it, leaving the rest of it a gaping maw of darkness. Lara stared into it, feeling a pull in her chest, an inexplicable urge to step closer. The air around it was different, warmer, thicker, almost alive with an energy she couldn't explain. She took a cautious step toward the edge, her heart pounding in her chest. The pit seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as the veins in the walls, as if it were connected to the very lifeblood of the cavern. The closer she got, the stronger the pull became. It was as if the pit was calling to her, beckoning her to step forward, to leap into the void. She clenched her fists, fighting against the strange compulsion. Her mind screamed at her to stop, but her body continued to move, one step at a time. As she reached the edge, the ground beneath her feet trembled. A low, guttural sound echoed from the depths of the pit, vibrating through the floor and up into her bones. It was a sound unlike anything she had ever heard, a deep, otherworldly growl that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. Lara stepped back instinctively, her heart racing in her chest. The pit pulsed again, and this time, something stirred within it. A shadow rose from the depths, dark and formless, shifting and writhing like smoke. It moved slowly at first, rising from the pit like a creature waking from a deep slumber. As it ascended, its shape began to solidify. Long, twisted limbs, a body covered in jagged, spiny protrusions, and eyes that glowed a sickly yellow in the darkness. The creature towered over Lara, its massive form dwarfing her completely. Its skin was black and slick, glistening in the faint red light. Its eyes locked onto her, unblinking, filled with a hunger that made her blood run cold. For a moment, neither of them moved. Lara stood frozen in place, her mind racing with terror, while the creature watched her with cold, calculating eyes. And then, with a sudden, bone-chilling roar, it lunged. Lara dove to the side just in time, the creature's massive claws slashing through the air where she had been standing moments before. She hit the ground hard, her injured ankle screaming in pain, but she didn't stop. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and began to run. The cavern echoed with the sound of the creature's pursuit, its heavy footsteps shaking the ground with each step. Lara ran blindly through the darkness, her heart pounding in her chest, her legs burning with exhaustion. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to get away. The creature roared again, the sound reverberating through the cavern, shaking the very walls. It was faster than she had expected, closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. She could feel its hot breath on the back of her neck, its claws scraping against the stone floor as it lunged after her. Lara's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of panic and fear. She had no weapon, no way to defend herself. She was helpless against this thing, whatever it was. Her only hope was to keep running, to stay ahead of it for as long as she could. The cavern stretched on endlessly, the walls twisting and turning as she ran. The red glow from the veins grew dimmer with each step, the darkness closing in around her. Her lungs burned with the effort, her ankle throbbing with each step, but she couldn't stop. Not now. The creature was gaining on her, its massive form blotting out the faint light as it closed the distance. Lara's legs were heavy, her movements sluggish, but she pushed herself harder, forcing her body to keep going. And then, just as she thought she could run no more, she saw it, an opening in the far wall of the cavern, barely visible in the dim light. It was small, narrow, but it was her only chance. With one final burst of energy, Lara sprinted toward the opening, the creature right behind her. She dove through the narrow gap, the creature's claws scraping against the stone as it tried to follow. But it was too large, its massive body unable to fit through the narrow passage. It roared in frustration, slamming its claws against the walls of the cavern, but it was trapped on the other side. Lara collapsed onto the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The creature's roars echoed behind her, but it couldn't reach her now. For the moment, she was safe. But she knew, deep down, that this nightmare was far from over. Chapter 9. The Abyss Beckons. Lara lay on the cold stone floor, her body spent from the escape. Every inch of her ached, her muscles burning with exhaustion, her breath ragged in the icy air. She stared at the ceiling of the cavern, the dim red veins still pulsing faintly, as though mocking her with their indifferent rhythm. The creature's roars echoed faintly through the narrow passageway behind her, but the barrier held. For now, After what felt like an eternity, Lara forced herself to move. Her body protested with every motion, but she knew she couldn't stay here. The darkness that surrounded her felt too alive, too sentient. She could feel its weight pressing down on her, urging her deeper into its depths. She sat up slowly, her ankle throbbing with a dull, persistent pain. The injury had worsened from the frantic chase, the swelling making it almost impossible to walk. She tore a strip of cloth from her already tattered shirt and bound it tightly around her ankle, gritting her teeth against the pain. It was a temporary fix, but it would have to do. The narrow passage before her was just wide enough for her to squeeze through. It was claustrophobic, the walls so close that they brushed against her arms as she moved. The air was thick and musty, the scent of earth and decay growing stronger with each step. There was no light ahead, no indication of where the tunnel led, but there was no other choice. She had to keep going. The passage seemed endless, twisting and turning with no discernible pattern. Lara could feel the weight of the rock pressing in on her from all sides, the silence so oppressive that it felt like a physical force. Her breath echoed faintly in the enclosed space, each exhale a reminder of how alone she truly was. After what felt like hours of crawling through the narrow tunnel, the passage widened. The walls began to recede, giving her room to stand once again. She pulled herself to her feet, her injured ankle screaming in protest, but she pushed through the pain. The space she found herself in was smaller than the cavern she had just escaped, but it was no less unsettling. The walls were slick with moisture, the red veins gone, leaving only the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi to light the area. The floor was uneven, scattered with jagged rocks and small pools of stagnant water. The air was still and heavy, the silence thick with an unnatural tension. Lara moved cautiously through the chamber, her eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. She could sense that something was different here. The atmosphere was heavier, as though the very ground beneath her was alive with some dark, malevolent force. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a gnawing sensation, like a predator watching her from just beyond the edge of her vision. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound of it deafening in the quiet. Every step felt like it was leading her closer to some inevitable confrontation, a final reckoning that she wasn't sure she was prepared to face. As she moved deeper into the chamber, she noticed something strange about the walls. At first, she thought they were just cracks in the rock, but as she got closer, she realized they were carvings. Symbols, intricate and ancient, etched into the stone with a precision that made her skin crawl. They were unlike anything she had ever seen. Their meanings elusive, yet they radiated a sense of dread that made her heart race. The symbols lined the walls in neat rows, spiraling around the chamber like a perverse kind of artwork. Some were geometric, others twisted and organic, resembling strange creatures or figures that defied logic. The longer she stared at them, the more they seemed to shift and move, as if the rock itself was alive, writhing beneath her gaze. Lara tore her eyes away from the carvings, her breath quickening. She knew better than to linger too long. Whatever force had etched those symbols into the stone was still present, still watching, waiting. Her path led her to the far side of the chamber, where the walls seemed to rise higher, disappearing into the darkness above. There was something there, something large and ancient, barely visible in the dim light. Lara's heart skipped a beat as she approached, her steps faltering. It was a door, massive and imposing. The door stood as a monument to some long-forgotten past. It was carved from the same dark stone as the rest of the cavern, but it was adorned with symbols far more intricate than those on the walls. The surface of the door shimmered faintly, as though it were coated in a thin layer of liquid, and the symbols pulsed with a dark, foreboding energy. Lara stood before it, her mind racing. The door was unlike anything she had ever seen. It seemed ancient beyond measure, as though it had been here long before any civilization she could comprehend. And yet, it was not a relic of the past. It was alive, humming with an energy that sent chills down her spine. Her hand hovered over the surface of the door, trembling with uncertainty. She could feel the power emanating from it, a force that both repelled and attracted her. She knew, deep down, that whatever lay beyond this door was something beyond human understanding. something far older and far more dangerous than the creature that had pursued her through the cavern. But there was no other path. This was the way forward. Lara took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her fingers brushed against the cold, slick surface of the door. The symbols beneath her touch flared to life, glowing a deep crimson, as if awakened by her presence. The door rumbled, the sound vibrating through the stone floor, shaking the very ground beneath her feet. She stepped back as the door began to move, slowly, groaning as it swung open. The air that rushed out from beyond was cold and stale, carrying with it the scent of something ancient and long buried. The chamber beyond the door was vast, its ceiling lost in the darkness above. The walls were lined with more of the strange symbols, glowing faintly in the dim light. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, its surface covered in dark stains, as though it had been used for some unspeakable purpose. Lara stepped cautiously into the room, her eyes scanning every corner. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, the weight of it pressing down on her like a physical force. She could feel it in her chest, a heaviness that made it difficult to breathe. The altar dominated the room, its presence commanding and terrifying. As she approached, she could see that the dark stains were old, dried blood, smeared across the stone in patterns that resembled the symbols on the walls. The sight made her stomach churn, but she forced herself to move closer. There was something on the altar, something wrapped in a tattered, ancient cloth. It was small, no larger than a child, but the energy it radiated was immense, overwhelming. The cloth seemed to pulse with the same dark energy that filled the room, as though whatever lay beneath it was alive, waiting to be awakened. Lara's hand trembled as she reached for the cloth, her mind screaming at her to stop, but she couldn't. Some invisible force guided her hand, pulling her closer to the object on the altar. As her fingers brushed against the fabric, the room suddenly grew colder. The symbols on the walls flared to life, glowing brightly, casting eerie shadows across the chamber. The air vibrated with a low hum, a sound that resonated deep within her chest, shaking her to her core. She hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, before finally pulling the cloth away. Beneath it lay a small, blackened object, an ancient artifact, twisted and gnarled, its surface covered in intricate carvings. It looked like a relic from a forgotten time, a remnant of some long-lost civilization. As soon as the cloth was removed, the room plunged into darkness. The symbols on the walls dimmed, their light fading until only the faintest glow remained. The hum grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through the air like the heartbeat of the earth itself. And then, from the shadows, something moved. Lara's breath caught in her throat as a figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form shrouded in shadow, its eyes glowing a faint, malevolent red. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. Lara's body froze, her mind screaming with terror, but she couldn't move. The figure reached out, its hand hovering over the artifact on the altar. And with a single touch, the world shattered. Chapter 10. The Awakening. The world trembled as the figure's hand touched the artifact. The chamber was filled with a blinding light that seemed to pierce through the darkness like 1,000 razor-sharp shards. Lara shielded her eyes, her body thrown backward by the force of the explosion. She hit the ground hard, the impact jarring her bones and sending a wave of agony through her injured ankle. When the light finally receded, the chamber was eerily silent. Lara blinked, her vision gradually adjusting to the dim glow that remained. The symbols on the walls had gone dark, their crimson light extinguished. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted somewhat, but the air was still charged with a lingering sense of dread. The figure had vanished, and in its place, the artifact lay alone on the altar. It was no longer blackened and gnarled, but had transformed into a smooth, polished surface, reflecting the faint light like a mirror. The carvings on its surface were still intricate, but they seemed to be shifting, changing as she watched, their shapes moving in a slow, hypnotic dance. Lara pushed herself to her feet, her ankle throbbing with every movement. She limped over to the altar, her eyes fixed on the artifact. The transformation had left her both fascinated and fearful. She felt a pull towards it, an inexplicable urge to touch it, but her instincts warned her of the danger. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the artifact. The room was still, the air thick with anticipation, but there was no sound, no movement, just the lingering echo of the figure's presence and the pulsing energy of the artifact. The artifact seemed to resonate with a low hum, a sound that was barely perceptible but nonetheless present. It was as if it were calling to her, its energy reaching out to her in a way she couldn't fully comprehend. The hum grew louder, more insistent, until it became almost unbearable. Lara reached out and touched the artifact. The moment her fingers made contact, a jolt of energy surged through her body. It was like a current of electricity, racing through her veins, making her entire body convulse. She gasped, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts, as the artifact seemed to come alive beneath her touch. The room around her began to shift. The walls of the chamber warped and distorted, the symbols on them glowing once again with a sickly green light. The air grew colder, and a chill swept through the chamber, making Lara shiver uncontrollably. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched the beating of her own heart. The artifact's surface rippled, its carvings shifting and changing with a fluid motion. Lara could see scenes unfolding within the polished surface, visions of ancient rituals, shadowy figures, and cosmic horrors that defied comprehension. The images were fleeting and fragmented, but they conveyed a sense of profound darkness and terror. The chamber seemed to expand, the walls stretching outward, revealing more of the symbols that had once been hidden in the darkness. The ceiling rose, revealing an expanse of stars and galaxies, as though she were standing in the heart of the universe itself. The space felt infinite, boundless, a void of pure, unadulterated dread. Lara's mind reeled from the sights and sensations. She felt as though she were being pulled into the very fabric of reality, her consciousness merging with the ancient power that the artifact contained. The energy was overwhelming, almost too much to bear, but she couldn't let go. The pull was too strong, the connection too intense. She tried to pull her hand away, but it was as though an invisible force was holding it in place. Her fingers were fused with the artifact, unable to move, unable to escape. The visions within its surface grew more chaotic, more violent, the scenes of cosmic horror becoming increasingly vivid and disturbing. The chamber was no longer a physical space, but a realm of pure energy and emotion. Lara felt herself becoming a part of it, her sense of self dissolving into the void. The ancient symbols on the walls seemed to reach out to her, their energy intertwining with her own, as if they were drawing her into their dark embrace. The room swirled around her, the stars and galaxies merging into a single, pulsating mass. Lara's vision blurred, her mind overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the force she was connected to. The air was filled with a cacophony of sounds, whispers, roars, and the eerie hum of the artifact, all merging into a single, unbearable noise. And then, as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The energy surged one last time, and Lara was thrown back, her hand finally breaking free from the artifact. She fell to the ground, gasping for breath, her body trembling from the exertion. The chamber was quiet again, the cosmic visions gone, leaving only the dim glow of the symbols on the walls. The artifact lay on the altar, its surface now dark and lifeless, the energy that had once pulsed within it now extinguished. Lara pushed herself to her feet, her body weak and unsteady. She looked around the chamber, the disorientation of the experience still lingering. The room felt different now, less oppressive, but still filled with a sense of ancient power and foreboding. Her ankle was swollen and painful, making it difficult to walk, but she knew she couldn't stay here. There was no telling what the artifact's awakening had unleashed, and she needed to find a way out before it was too late. She limped toward the exit, her movements slow and deliberate. The chamber seemed to close in around her, the walls shifting and warping as she moved. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows that danced and twisted in the dim light. As she approached the passageway, she felt a sudden chill, as though the air around her had turned icy. She glanced back at the altar, but the artifact was gone. The altar was now empty, its surface slick and bare. The symbols on the walls had faded, leaving only the dark, smooth stone. Lara's heart raced as she turned and continued down the passageway, her steps quickening despite the pain in her ankle. She had no idea what lay ahead, but she couldn't afford to waste any more time. The chamber had revealed a fraction of the terror that awaited her, and she had to keep moving if she hoped to survive. The passageway led her through a series of twisting tunnels, each one darker and more foreboding than the last. The air grew colder with each step, the silence growing more oppressive. The walls seemed to close in on her, the passages narrowing until she felt as though she were moving through a tunnel of pure darkness. Finally, after what felt like hours of crawling through the claustrophobic tunnels, she emerged into a new chamber. This one was different from the others, a vast, open space with a high, domed ceiling. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with ancient, dusty tomes and strange artifacts. The chamber was filled with a sense of forgotten history, a place where time had stood still. The air was thick with the smell of old books and decaying paper, and the silence was almost palpable. Lara moved cautiously through the room, her eyes scanning the shelves, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She noticed a large, ornate book lying open on a pedestal in the center of the room. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, their meanings indecipherable. The book seemed to hum with a faint, eerie energy, and Lara felt an inexplicable pull towards it. With a sense of foreboding, she approached the pedestal, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch the book. As her hand made contact with the cover, the room seemed to shift once again, the air growing colder, the darkness deepening. The book's pages fluttered as though stirred by an invisible wind, and the symbols on them began to glow with a faint, otherworldly light. The hum grew louder, resonating through the chamber, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. Lara knew that whatever lay within the pages of the book held the key to understanding the horrors she had encountered. She could feel the weight of its knowledge, its power, and the danger it represented. With a deep breath, she turned the pages, her eyes scanning the strange symbols, searching for answers in the darkness. Chapter 11. The Forgotten Knowledge. Lara's fingers traced the strange symbols on the book's pages, her eyes moving rapidly over the intricate diagrams and arcane script. The chamber was silent except for the eerie hum emanating from the book, a sound that seemed to resonate deep within her bones. The symbols were unfamiliar, their meanings elusive, but there was an undeniable sense of power radiating from them. The room around her was vast and filled with forgotten artifacts. Shelves lined the walls, their contents obscured by a thick layer of dust. Ancient scrolls, dusty tomes, and bizarre relics were scattered haphazardly, their surfaces coated with a patina of age. Lara's attention was drawn back to the book, her curiosity and apprehension battling for dominance. As she turned the pages, the symbols began to shift and change, their forms fluid and dynamic. The diagrams depicted elaborate rituals and celestial alignments, their purpose unclear but their intricacy undeniable. The more she examined the pages, the more she felt a growing sense of unease. The symbols seemed to be alive, their movements hypnotic, as though they were trying to communicate something profound and terrifying. Lara's fingers continued to move over the pages, feeling the texture of the ancient paper beneath her touch. The pages were fragile, their edges worn and frayed. She carefully turned each one, mindful of the delicate nature of the book. The diagrams grew increasingly complex, the symbols intertwining in a dizzying array of patterns. At the center of the book was a large, elaborate diagram. It depicted a vast, cosmic structure, a network of celestial bodies connected by a series of glowing lines. The diagram was surrounded by a series of inscriptions, their meanings still indecipherable. The more Lara stared at the diagram, the more she felt a sense of dread. The cosmic structure seemed to pulse with a dark energy, its lines glowing with an eerie light. Lara's gaze was drawn to a small, ornate box on one of the shelves. It was intricately carved, its surface covered in strange symbols. The box was adorned with a series of metal clasps and hinges, its design both elegant and unsettling. She moved cautiously towards it, her heart racing with anticipation and fear. The box was surprisingly heavy, its weight pressing down on her as she lifted it from the shelf. She carefully set it down on the pedestal beside the book, examining its intricate design. The carvings on the box seemed to match the symbols in the book, their patterns overlapping in a way that suggested a deeper connection. With trembling hands, Lara began to open the box. The clasps clicked open with a soft, metallic sound, and the lid swung open with a creak. Inside, nestled in a bed of velvet, was a small, crystalline object. It was transparent, its surface smooth and shimmering with an otherworldly light. The object seemed to pulse with a faint energy, its glow reflecting the symbols in the book. Lara's fingers hesitated above the crystal. She could feel the power emanating from it, a force that was both alluring and frightening. She carefully lifted the crystal from the box, its surface cool and smooth against her skin. As she held it up, the light from the crystal seemed to illuminate the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. Lara could see her breath in the air, the chill making her shiver uncontrollably. The crystal's glow intensified, its light growing brighter and more intense. The symbols in the book began to glow in response, their energy merging with the light from the crystal. The chamber was filled with a low, rhythmic pulsing, a sound that seemed to resonate with the beat of Lara's own heart. The walls of the room seemed to shift and warp, the shelves and artifacts distorting as if the very fabric of reality was bending to the will of the crystal. Lara felt a strange sensation, as though she were being drawn into the crystal's light. The air around her seemed to vibrate with a powerful energy, and the symbols on the walls and the book began to move, their patterns intertwining and merging into a single, cohesive design. The energy was overwhelming, a force that seemed to permeate every corner of the chamber. The crystal's glow grew even brighter, its light now a blinding, almost unbearable intensity. Lara had to shield her eyes, the light searing through her vision. The pulsing energy seemed to reach out, enveloping her in a cocoon of light and sound. The chamber around her was lost in the brilliance, the walls, shelves, and artifacts dissolving into a sea of pure, radiant energy. As the light reached its peak, Lara felt a sudden, powerful jolt. It was as if she had been pulled through a vortex, her entire being spinning through a maelstrom of energy. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying, a whirlwind of sensations that left her disoriented and breathless. When the light finally faded, Lara found herself in a new, unfamiliar space. The chamber was gone, replaced by a vast, open landscape that stretched out before her. The sky was a deep, unsettling shade of red, and the ground was covered in a strange, luminescent mist. The air was thick with an otherworldly energy, and the landscape was dotted with bizarre structures and formations that defied logic. The space was both mesmerizing and terrifying, a realm that seemed to exist outside the boundaries of reality. The mist swirled around her, shifting and changing as if alive. The structures in the distance were large and alien, their forms both beautiful and horrifying. Lara felt a sense of profound unease, as though she were standing on the threshold of some ancient and malevolent force. She began to move through the landscape, her steps tentative and cautious. The ground beneath her feet was soft and yielding, the mist swirling around her with each step. The structures loomed overhead, their shapes shifting and changing as she approached. The air was filled with a faint, rhythmic hum, a sound that seemed to echo through the strange realm. As she walked, Lara noticed that the mist was beginning to coalesce into shapes, forms that resembled the symbols from the book. The symbols floated in the air, their light casting eerie shadows on the ground. The shapes seemed to follow her, their movements synchronized with her own. It was as if the symbols were guiding her through the landscape, leading her towards a destination that was both unknown and foreboding. The path ahead was obscured by the shifting mist, but Lara could see a faint, pulsing light in the distance. The light was a deep, crimson color, its glow casting an ominous hue over the landscape. She felt a powerful urge to move towards it, an instinctual drive that she couldn't ignore. As she approached the source of the light, the mist began to thin, revealing a large, towering structure. It was a massive, ancient edifice, its surface covered in the same strange symbols that had appeared in the book. The structure was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, its design both intricate and alien. The structure seemed to resonate with the same energy as the crystal, its surface glowing with a dark, pulsing light. The symbols on its walls shifted and changed, their patterns forming an elaborate design that seemed to convey a sense of profound and ancient knowledge. Lara felt a sense of awe and trepidation as she approached the structure, her steps slow and deliberate. The entrance to the structure was an enormous archway, its surface adorned with more of the shifting symbols. The archway seemed to beckon her, its light casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Lara felt a powerful pull towards it, an irresistible urge to step through the threshold. With a deep breath, she moved towards the archway. The moment she crossed its threshold, she was enveloped in a blinding light. The landscape around her dissolved into a whirlwind of colors and sensations, the mist swirling around her in a chaotic dance. When the light faded, Lara found herself in a new, enclosed space. It was a vast, cavernous chamber, its walls lined with ancient symbols and inscriptions. The chamber was filled with a dim, ambient light, the source of which was unclear. The air was thick with a sense of ancient power and knowledge, and the atmosphere was heavy with an oppressive silence. In the center of the chamber stood a massive, ornate pedestal. On the pedestal was a large, open tome, its pages filled with the same intricate symbols and diagrams that had appeared in the book from the previous chamber. The tome seemed to pulse with a faint, dark energy, its presence both commanding and unsettling. Lara moved cautiously towards the pedestal, her eyes fixed on the tome. The chamber felt different from the previous spaces, less alien, more grounded, but still filled with an intense sense of power and mystery. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly, their light casting eerie shadows across the chamber. As she approached the tome, she could feel the weight of its knowledge, the depth of its ancient wisdom. The symbols on the pages seemed to come alive, their meanings shifting and changing as she watched. The energy in the chamber was palpable, a force that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of reality. Lara's hand reached out to touch the tome, her fingers trembling with anticipation and fear. The moment she made contact, the chamber was filled with a powerful surge of energy. The symbols on the walls and pages glowed with an intense light, the room vibrating with a deep, resonant hum. The tome's pages began to turn on their own, the symbols shifting and changing in a mesmerizing dance. The energy in the chamber grew stronger, the light becoming almost unbearable. Lara's senses were overwhelmed by the force of the knowledge being revealed, the symbols on the pages seeming to communicate a profound and terrifying truth. The chamber was alive with energy, the symbols and inscriptions converging into a single, cohesive design. The light from the tome illuminated the room, casting an eerie glow on the walls and floor. Lara felt herself being drawn into the energy, her consciousness merging with the ancient power of the tome. As the light reached its peak, the chamber seemed to dissolve into a whirlwind of colors and sensations. Lara was enveloped in a blinding brilliance, her mind and body overwhelmed by the intensity of the force. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying, a whirlwind of knowledge and power that left her breathless. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The light faded, the energy dissipating into the ether. The chamber was quiet again, the only sound the soft rustling of the tome's pages as they came to a rest. Lara stood alone in the chamber, her mind reeling from the experience. The tome was still open on the pedestal, its pages now filled with a series of intricate symbols and diagrams. The chamber was dim, the ambient light casting eerie shadows on the walls. She felt a profound sense of exhaustion and disorientation. The knowledge she had encountered was both overwhelming and unsettling, its implications vast and terrifying. The chamber was a repository of ancient power, a place where time and reality seemed to merge into a single, cohesive force. Lara took a deep breath, her body trembling from the exertion. She knew that the journey was far from over, that the knowledge she had uncovered was just the beginning of a greater and more terrifying truth. With a sense of resolve, she turned and began to move towards the exit, her steps slow and deliberate as she prepared for whatever lay ahead. The chamber was silent, the air thick with the remnants of the energy that had filled it. Lara could feel the weight of the tome's knowledge pressing down on her, a reminder of the ancient power that awaited her discovery. As she moved towards the exit, the symbols on the wall seemed to shift and change, their patterns a reflection of the profound and terrifying journey that lay ahead. Chapter 12. The Shattered Illusions. Lara emerged from the cavernous chamber into a new realm, the transition from the previous space almost disorienting. The landscape before her was stark and alien, a barren expanse of jagged rocks and shifting sands. The sky above was a tumultuous swirl of dark clouds and eerie light, casting a dim, otherworldly glow across the terrain. The ground was uneven and treacherous, with sharp, craggy outcrops jutting from the surface. The sands beneath her feet were shifting and unstable, creating a constant, unsettling sensation as she walked. The air was thick with an oppressive heat, the warmth radiating from the ground in waves that distorted the landscape. In the distance, Lara could see a series of towering spires rising from the ground. They were tall and thin, their surfaces covered in strange, pulsating runes. The spires seemed to emit a faint, eerie light, their glow casting long, distorted shadows across the sand. Despite their foreboding appearance, they seemed to beckon her forward, a silent invitation to explore. Lara moved cautiously towards the spires, her steps deliberate and measured. The shifting sands made each step a challenge, the ground shifting beneath her feet as she walked. The heat was oppressive, and the air was filled with a faint, rhythmic hum, a sound that seemed to resonate with the pulsating runes on the spires. As she approached the nearest spire, she noticed that its surface was covered in intricate carvings and symbols. The runes were ancient and unfamiliar, their meanings elusive. The spire itself was smooth and polished, its surface reflecting the eerie light from the sky. The runes seemed to shift and change as she moved, their patterns merging and evolving in a mesmerizing dance. Lara reached out to touch the spire, her fingers brushing against the smooth surface. The moment she made contact, a sudden jolt of energy surged through her. The spire seemed to vibrate with a deep, resonant hum, and the runes on its surface began to glow with an intense, pulsing light. The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the sky above grew darker, the clouds swirling in a chaotic dance. The light from the spire intensified, casting eerie shadows across the landscape. The air was filled with a powerful, oppressive energy, and Lara felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of fear. The spire seemed to be alive, its energy resonating with a force that was both captivating and terrifying. As the light reached its peak, the ground around the spire began to shift and change. The sands transformed into a dark, obsidian-like substance, and the jagged rocks grew taller, their surfaces covered in the same shifting runes. The spire's energy seemed to be reshaping the landscape, bending reality to its will. Lara stumbled back, her mind reeling from the intensity of the energy. The landscape was becoming increasingly distorted, the once familiar terrain now a nightmarish expanse of dark, shifting forms. The spires loomed overhead, their runes glowing with an eerie light that seemed to warp and distort the space around them. The rhythmic hum grew louder, its sound resonating with a deep, unsettling frequency. The runes on the spires seemed to pulse in time with the hum, their patterns shifting and merging in a chaotic dance. The air was filled with a sense of profound unease, the oppressive energy weighing heavily on Lara. She moved away from the spire, her steps unsteady as she navigated the shifting landscape. The ground beneath her feet was now a treacherous mixture of obsidian and shifting sands, the once stable terrain now a chaotic and unstable expanse. The spires loomed in the distance, their glowing runes casting long, distorted shadows across the sand. In the distance, Lara noticed a series of strange, floating orbs of light. They hovered in the air, their glow casting a soft, flickering illumination on the distorted landscape. The orbs seemed to move in a deliberate, rhythmic pattern, their light shifting and changing as they floated through the air. Lara followed the orbs, her curiosity piqued by their presence. The orbs moved in a way that suggested they were guiding her, leading her through the chaotic terrain. She moved carefully, her steps cautious as she navigated the shifting ground. As she approached a cluster of orbs, she noticed that they were hovering around a large, ornate structure. The structure was a massive, intricate archway, its surface covered in the same shifting runes as the spires. The archway seemed to pulse with an eerie light, its energy resonating with the same deep, rhythmic hum that filled the air. Lara moved through the archway, her heart racing with anticipation and fear. The moment she crossed the threshold, she was enveloped in a swirling vortex of light and energy. The world around her seemed to dissolve into a whirlwind of colors and sensations, the ground and sky merging into a single, chaotic expanse. When the light finally faded, Lara found herself in a new, enclosed space. The room was vast and cavernous, its walls lined with intricate symbols and carvings. The air was thick with a sense of ancient power and knowledge, the atmosphere heavy with an oppressive silence. In the center of the room stood a massive, ornate pedestal. On the pedestal was a large, open tome, its pages filled with the same shifting runes and diagrams that had appeared in the previous spaces. The tome seemed to pulse with a faint, dark energy, its presence both commanding and unsettling. Lara approached the pedestal, her eyes fixed on the tome. The room felt different from the previous spaces, less alien, more grounded, but still filled with an intense sense of power and mystery. The symbols on the walls seemed to glow faintly, their light casting eerie shadows across the room. As she reached out to touch the tome, she could feel the weight of its knowledge, the depth of its ancient wisdom. The runes on the pages seemed to come alive, their meanings shifting and changing as she watched. The energy in the room was palpable, a force that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of reality. Lara's fingers brushed against the pages, the texture of the ancient paper beneath her touch. The moment she made contact, the room was filled with a powerful surge of energy. The runes on the walls and pages glowed with an intense light, the room vibrating with a deep, resonant hum. The tome's pages began to turn on their own, the runes shifting and changing in a mesmerizing dance. The energy in the room grew stronger, the light becoming almost unbearable. Lara's senses were overwhelmed by the force of the knowledge being revealed, the runes on the pages seeming to communicate a profound and terrifying truth. The room was alive with energy, the symbols and inscriptions converging into a single, cohesive design. The light from the tome illuminated the room, casting an eerie glow on the walls and floor. Lara felt herself being drawn into the energy, her consciousness merging with the ancient power of the tome. As the light reached its peak, the room seemed to dissolve into a whirlwind of colors and sensations. Lara was enveloped in a blinding brilliance, her mind and body overwhelmed by the intensity of the force. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying, a whirlwind of knowledge and power that left her breathless. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The light faded, the energy dissipating into the ether. The room was quiet again, the only sound the soft rustling of the tome's pages as they came to a rest. Lara stood alone in the room, her mind reeling from the experience. The tome was still open on the pedestal, its pages now filled with a series of intricate symbols and diagrams. The room was dim, the ambient light casting eerie shadows on the walls. She felt a profound sense of exhaustion and disorientation. The knowledge she had encountered was both overwhelming and unsettling, its implications vast and terrifying. The room was a repository of ancient power, a place where time and reality seemed to merge into a single, cohesive force. Lara took a deep breath, her body trembling from the exertion. She knew that the journey was far from over, that the knowledge she had uncovered was just the beginning of a greater and more terrifying truth. With a sense of resolve, she turned and began to move towards the exit, her steps slow and deliberate as she prepared for whatever lay ahead. The room was silent, the air thick with the remnants of the energy that had filled it. Lara could feel the weight of the tome's knowledge pressing down on her, a reminder of the ancient power that awaited her discovery. As she moved towards the exit, the symbols on the walls seemed to shift and change, their patterns a reflection of the profound and terrifying journey that lay ahead. Chapter 13. The Labyrinth of Shadows. Lara emerged from the cavernous chamber into an expansive, shadowy labyrinth. The entrance was a narrow passage, opening into a vast network of twisting corridors and darkened hallways. The walls of the labyrinth were constructed from a dark, reflective material that seemed to absorb the scant light, casting long, eerie shadows that danced and shifted with every movement. The air was cold and damp, carrying a faint, musky odor that hinted at the age and neglect of the place. The ground beneath Lara's feet was uneven, a mixture of slick stone and crumbling debris that made each step treacherous. The labyrinth was silent except for the occasional distant drip of water echoing through the passageways. Lara took a deep breath, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The walls were adorned with ancient, faded inscriptions, their meanings obscured by time and decay. The inscriptions were intertwined with intricate, shadowy patterns that seemed to pulse with a dark energy. As Lara walked, the shadows on the walls seemed to writhe and shift, their movement creating a sense of disorientation. She moved cautiously through the labyrinth, each turn revealing more of the same dark, oppressive environment. The corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, their labyrinthine twists and turns creating an almost claustrophobic feeling. The shadows on the walls grew darker and more complex, their patterns forming eerie shapes and symbols. As Lara navigated the labyrinth, she noticed that some sections of the walls were lined with shelves containing ancient, dusty artifacts. The artifacts were strange and unfamiliar. Rusted tools, broken pottery, and faded manuscripts. Each item seemed to have its own story, a silent testament to the long-forgotten past of the labyrinth. In one of the narrower corridors, Lara found a small alcove. Inside the alcove was a pedestal, atop which rested a delicate, ornate box. The box was intricately carved with the same shadowy symbols that adorned the labyrinth's walls. The box was locked with a complex mechanism, its surface covered in dark, shifting runes. Lara approached the pedestal with caution, her eyes fixed on the box. The runes on the box seemed to react to her presence, their patterns shifting and glowing faintly. The air around the box felt charged with an electric tension, as if the object held a powerful and mysterious force. She reached out to touch the box, her fingers brushing against its cold surface. The moment she made contact, the labyrinth around her seemed to respond. The shadows on the walls grew darker and more intense, and the distant drips of water became louder, echoing through the corridors like a haunting melody. The box began to tremble, its runes glowing with an intense, pulsating light. The mechanism on the box clicked and shifted, as if reacting to Lara's touch. The light from the runes grew brighter, casting a harsh, flickering illumination on the surrounding walls. Lara stepped back, her heart racing as the box continued to tremble. The shadows on the walls seemed to converge on the pedestal, their patterns forming a swirling vortex of darkness. The air was filled with a low, resonant hum, the sound vibrating through the labyrinth. As the light from the box reached its peak, the labyrinth around Lara began to change. The walls and corridors seemed to shift and warp, the once familiar passages now a chaotic maze of twisting shadows and distorted shapes. The sense of disorientation grew more intense, the labyrinth becoming a nightmarish landscape of dark, shifting forms. Lara struggled to maintain her bearings, her footsteps unsteady as she navigated the changing maze. The shadows on the walls seemed to close in around her, their dark forms reaching out as if to ensnare her. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, the labyrinth itself seeming to pulse with a dark, malevolent force. In the distance, Lara saw a faint glimmer of light. She moved towards it, her steps quickening as she fought against the growing sense of panic. The light was coming from a small opening in the labyrinth's wall, a narrow passage that seemed to lead to another part of the maze. She reached the opening and squeezed through, emerging into a new section of the labyrinth. This area was slightly different from the rest. The walls were covered in strange, luminescent markings, their glow casting a soft, eerie light. The ground was smoother here, the debris and uneven surfaces replaced by a polished, dark stone. The passage continued, leading Lara through a series of interconnected chambers. Each chamber was unique, its walls adorned with different symbols and carvings. The chambers seemed to tell a story, each one revealing a different aspect of the labyrinth's dark history. In one chamber, Lara found a large, ornate mirror. The mirror's surface was covered in intricate, swirling patterns, and its frame was adorned with dark, reflective gemstones. The mirror seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light, its surface shifting and warping as she approached. Lara stood in front of the mirror, her reflection distorted and fragmented. The surface of the mirror seemed to ripple, the reflections warping and twisting into strange, unsettling shapes. The air around the mirror was charged with an intense energy, the sense of malevolence almost palpable. As Lara stared into the mirror, she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The reflections seemed to come alive, the distorted shapes coalescing into shadowy figures that moved with a dark, menacing grace. The figures seemed to reach out from the mirror, their dark forms pressing against the surface as if trying to break through. Lara stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. The mirror's surface began to glow with an intense, blinding light, the energy emanating from it filling the chamber with a harsh, flickering illumination. The shadows on the walls seemed to grow darker, their patterns converging into a chaotic dance. The light from the mirror reached its peak, casting long, distorted shadows across the chamber. The ground beneath Lara's feet trembled, and the chamber seemed to dissolve into a whirlwind of colors and sensations. The mirror's light was overwhelming, its intensity causing the labyrinth itself to warp and shift. As the light faded, Lara found herself back in the familiar network of corridors. The labyrinth had returned to its previous state, the walls and shadows now eerily still. The sense of disorientation and fear lingered, the echoes of the mirror's dark energy still present in the air. Lara continued through the labyrinth, her steps slow and deliberate as she navigated the shifting passages. The oppressive atmosphere and the ever-present shadows made each step a challenge, the labyrinth becoming an increasingly nightmarish landscape. She pressed on, determined to uncover the labyrinth's secrets. The journey through the maze was far from over, and the shadows that lurked within held their own dark truths. With a sense of resolve, Lara continued her exploration, the labyrinth's dark and shifting corridors leading her deeper into the unknown. Chapter 14. The Veil of Nightmares. Lara emerged from the shifting maze of the labyrinth into a new and unsettling environment. The transition was abrupt, as if she had stepped through a veil that separated two vastly different realms. The new space was a vast, cavernous expanse bathed in a perpetual twilight. The sky above was a swirling mixture of dark purples and blues, illuminated only by distant, flickering stars that provided no warmth or light. The ground beneath her was a strange, spongy substance that felt like walking on a thick, damp moss. It was dark and uneven, with occasional patches of blackened, cracked earth. The air was heavy with a chilling mist that seemed to cling to her skin, and an eerie silence pervaded the space, broken only by the occasional, distant echo of what sounded like whispers. Lara walked forward, her footsteps muffled by the spongy ground. In the distance, she saw the outlines of enormous, gnarled trees with twisted branches that reached up towards the twilight sky. The trees were dark and skeletal, their bark cracked and weathered. The branches were adorned with strange, glowing orbs that emitted a faint, ghostly light, casting long, distorted shadows on the ground. As she approached the trees, Lara noticed that the space between them was filled with dense, fog-like tendrils that seemed to writhe and shift as she moved through them. The tendrils were dark and formless, their movement creating an ever-changing pattern that added to the sense of disorientation. The forest seemed endless, its paths twisting and turning in a labyrinthine manner. The trees appeared to shift and move, their positions changing subtly as Lara walked. The glowing orbs on the branches flickered erratically, casting strange, shifting patterns on the ground and creating an unsettling atmosphere. Lara followed one of the winding paths, her senses alert to the eerie surroundings. The mist grew thicker as she advanced, obscuring her view and making the path ahead seem like a ghostly apparition. The whispers in the air grew louder, though their source remained elusive. The whispers were incomprehensible, their voices blending into a haunting murmur that sent shivers down her spine. The path led her to a small clearing surrounded by ancient, towering trees. In the center of the clearing was a large, circular pool of dark water. The water was still and black, its surface reflecting the dim light from the glowing orbs above. The pool was surrounded by strange, twisted stones that seemed to be arranged in a deliberate pattern. Lara approached the pool with caution. The surface of the water was perfectly still, its darkness giving no hint of what lay beneath. The reflections in the water were distorted, the images shifting and warping in a manner that defied logic. The stones around the pool were covered in strange symbols and runes, their meanings elusive and incomprehensible. As she studied the pool, Lara noticed that the reflections in the water were not just distorted, but seemed to be alive. The images in the pool moved with a slow, deliberate rhythm, their shapes and patterns shifting and changing in a way that suggested a hidden, underlying reality. The whispers in the air grew louder, their voices merging with the reflections in the water to create a haunting, otherworldly symphony. Lara knelt by the edge of the pool, her eyes fixed on the shifting reflections. The surface of the water seemed to ripple, the images becoming more intense and vivid. The reflections showed glimpses of strange, nightmarish landscapes, forests of twisted trees, desolate wastelands, and shadowy figures moving through the darkness. The pool seemed to be a portal, its reflections offering glimpses into other realms and dimensions. Lara could feel a pull, a compulsion to look deeper into the water, to explore the nightmarish visions that danced before her eyes. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a cacophony of unsettling sounds. Unable to resist the allure of the pool, Lara extended her hand towards the water. The moment her fingers touched the surface, the reflections exploded into a chaotic whirlpool of colors and shapes. The water surged and bubbled, the dark liquid swirling with a violent intensity. Lara recoiled in surprise, stumbling backward. The pool's surface began to calm, the swirling waters slowly settling back into stillness. The reflections in the water were now clearer, showing a series of images that seemed to depict a dark, ancient ritual. The symbols and runes around the pool began to glow with a faint, eerie light, their patterns shifting and changing in response to the vision in the water. The clearing was bathed in an unsettling silence as Lara continued to observe the pool. The images in the water showed a series of scenes, dark figures performing an ancient rite, the ground being torn apart, and a powerful force emerging from the depths. The scenes were both mesmerizing and terrifying, their implications profound and ominous. Lara took a step back from the pool, her mind reeling from the visions. The clearing seemed to shift and warp, the trees and shadows moving in an almost imperceptible dance. The mist grew thicker, enveloping the area in a dense fog that obscured her view. Determined to understand the nature of the pool and the visions it revealed, Lara moved away from the clearing. The path through the forest was now even more disorienting, the mist swirling around her and making each step a challenge. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches creating an almost claustrophobic feeling. As she continued through the forest, the whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a haunting, discordant melody. The shadows on the ground seemed to reach out towards her, their dark forms stretching and shifting in a way that was both unsettling and mesmerizing. In the distance, Lara saw a faint glimmer of light. She moved towards it, her steps quickening as she fought against the oppressive atmosphere. The light was coming from a small, dilapidated structure partially obscured by the mist. The structure was ancient and weathered, its walls covered in dark, shifting symbols. Lara approached the structure, her curiosity piqued by its presence. The building was a small, circular shrine, its entrance partially hidden by overgrown vines and debris. The shrine was adorned with the same dark symbols that had appeared in the pool's reflections, their meanings still elusive and obscure. She entered the shrine, her senses alert to the eerie surroundings. The interior was dimly lit by a faint, flickering light emanating from an ornate, ancient altar. The altar was covered in strange artifacts and relics, their purposes and significance unknown. The air inside the shrine was thick with a sense of ancient power and mystery, the atmosphere heavy with an oppressive energy. Lara approached the altar, her her eyes fixed on the artifacts. The items on the altar included dark, twisted relics and ancient scrolls, their surfaces covered in the same shifting symbols that adorned the shrine's walls. The artifacts seemed to radiate a dark, malevolent energy, their presence both captivating and unsettling. As she studied the altar, Lara noticed a large, ornate book lying open on a pedestal. The book was covered in intricate, shifting runes, its pages filled with dark, cryptic inscriptions. The book seemed to be a repository of ancient knowledge, its presence both alluring and ominous. Lara reached out to touch the book, her fingers brushing against the ancient pages. The moment she made contact, the room was filled with a sudden surge of energy. The light from the shrine's altar intensified, casting harsh, flickering shadows on the walls. The artifacts and relics on the altar began to tremble, their dark energy resonating with the power of the book. The book's pages began to turn on their own, the runes and symbols shifting and changing in a mesmerizing dance. The energy in the room grew stronger, the air charged with a deep, resonant hum. The shadows on the walls seemed to come alive, their dark forms reaching out as if to envelop her. Lara took a step back, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and fascination. The room was alive with energy, the book's power filling the space with an intense, palpable force. The shadows on the walls danced and shifted, their patterns merging into a chaotic and unsettling display. As the light from the altar reached its peak, the shrine seemed to dissolve into a whirlwind of colors and sensations. The ground beneath Lara's feet trembled, and the room's walls seemed to warp and shift, the once familiar space now a nightmarish landscape of dark, shifting forms. The energy from the book surged and intensified, the room filled with a blinding brilliance. Lara was enveloped in a whirlwind of light and shadow, her senses overwhelmed by the force of the power being revealed. The sensation was both exhilarating and terrifying, a profound and unsettling experience that left her breathless. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped, the light faded, the energy dissipating into the ether. The shrine was quiet again, the only sound the soft rustling of the artifacts on the altar as they came to a rest. Lara stood alone in the shrine, her mind reeling from the experience. The book was still open on the pedestal, its pages now filled with a series of intricate symbols and diagrams. The shrine was dim, the ambient light casting eerie shadows on the walls. She felt a profound sense of exhaustion and disorientation. The knowledge she had encountered was both overwhelming and unsettling, its implications vast and terrifying. The shrine was a repository of ancient power, a place where time and reality seemed to merge into a single, cohesive force. Lara took a deep breath, her body trembling from the exertion. She knew that the journey was far from over, that the knowledge she had uncovered was just the beginning of a greater and more terrifying truth. With a sense of resolve, she prepared to continue her exploration, the labyrinth and its dark mysteries awaiting her next step. Chapter 15. The Convergence. Lara exited the ancient shrine, stepping back into the mist-shrouded forest. The atmosphere was dense and oppressive, the weight of the knowledge she had uncovered pressing heavily on her shoulders. The twilight sky above seemed darker and more foreboding, the stars flickering with an ominous, ghostly light. As she walked through the forest, the path seemed to shift and change with each step. The trees, now more twisted and gnarled, loomed over her, their dark forms casting long, unsettling shadows on the ground. The whispers in the air had grown louder, their voices melding into a constant, haunting murmur that reverberated through the mist. Lara's footsteps were muffled by the spongy ground, but the occasional crackling of branches and shifting of leaves added to the eerie silence. The forest seemed alive with a malevolent presence, the shadows and mist merging into a dark, undulating landscape. The further Lara walked, the more the environment seemed to warp and distort. The trees and shadows moved with an almost imperceptible rhythm, creating a sense of unease and disorientation. The path before her grew more chaotic, the once familiar surroundings now a nightmarish labyrinth of shifting forms and dark tendrils. In the distance, Lara saw a faint, flickering light. She moved towards it, her steps quickening as she navigated the increasingly treacherous terrain. The light grew brighter, revealing the outline of a massive, ancient structure partially obscured by the dense fog. The structure was unlike anything she had seen before. A colossal, dark edifice adorned with intricate carvings and glowing symbols. The structure was a towering monolith, its surface covered in the same shifting runes that had appeared in the shrine. The carvings seemed to pulse with a dark energy, their patterns shifting and changing in a way that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. The monolith was surrounded by a wide, circular platform, its edges lined with strange, luminous stones. Lara approached the monolith with a sense of both dread and curiosity. The platform was covered in dark, cracked earth, with patches of blackened, charred remains scattered around. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, the atmosphere charged with a palpable sense of anticipation. As she reached the monolith, Lara noticed that the runes and symbols on its surface seemed to form a complex pattern. The symbols were intertwined, their meanings obscured but their presence undeniably powerful. The monolith seemed to radiate a dark, resonant energy, its surface vibrating with a low, throbbing hum. At the base of the monolith was a large, circular indentation, its surface covered in ancient, shifting symbols. The indentation was empty, as if awaiting some object or force to complete the pattern. The energy emanating from the indentation was intense, a powerful force that seemed to draw Lara closer. Lara examined the indentation closely, her mind racing with the implications of what she had discovered. The symbols around the indentation were familiar. They matched the runes and carvings she had encountered in the shrine and the pool. The realization struck her with a sense of clarity. The monolith was a focal point, a convergence of the dark forces she had been exploring. With a sense of determination, Lara reached into her satchel and retrieved the ornate book she had found in the shrine. The book's pages were still open to the intricate symbols and diagrams she had studied. She approached the indentation, the book's energy resonating with the monolith's power. The moment she held the book above the indentation, the symbols on the monolith began to glow with a bright, pulsing light. The energy from the book seemed to merge with the monolith, the two forces converging in a powerful, harmonious surge. The monolith's surface rippled and shifted, the carvings and symbols aligning in a complex, glowing pattern. Lara carefully placed the book into the indentation. As the book touched the surface, the monolith responded with an intense burst of energy. The platform around the monolith trembled, and the dark earth cracked and shifted, revealing a deep, ominous chasm beneath. The chasm was filled with a swirling, shadowy mist that seemed to pulse with a dark, malevolent force. The convergence of energies was overwhelming, the monolith's power merging with the chasm's dark force. The mist in the chasm swirled and churned, its depths revealing glimpses of dark, twisted realms and nightmarish landscapes. The shadows on the ground grew darker and more intense, their patterns converging into a chaotic, swirling vortex. Lara stood back, her senses overwhelmed by the display of power. The monolith and the chasm seemed to be a gateway, a point of convergence between the realms she had explored and the dark, ancient forces that lay beyond. The light from the monolith's runes flickered and pulsed, casting long, eerie shadows across the platform. The whispers in the air grew louder, their voices blending into a cacophony of unsettling sounds. The atmosphere was charged with an intense energy, the convergence of forces creating a palpable sense of tension and anticipation. The shadows around Lara seemed to reach out towards her, their dark forms stretching and shifting in response to the power being unleashed. As the energy from the monolith and the chasm reached its peak, the entire structure began to dissolve into a whirlwind of colors and sensations. The ground trembled, and the sky above seemed to ripple and warp, the once familiar landscape now a nightmarish realm of shifting shapes and dark, chaotic forces. Lara felt a profound sense of both fear and awe as the structure disintegrated around her. The convergence of energies was both exhilarating and terrifying, a display of dark power that defied comprehension. The shadows and mist seemed to merge into a single, chaotic force, their patterns shifting and changing with an almost imperceptible rhythm. As the whirlwind of energy reached its zenith, Lara was enveloped in a blinding brilliance. The light and shadows converged into a single, overwhelming force, filling the space with a profound sense of finality and closure. The monolith and the chasm were no more. Their energies dissipated into the ether. The platform was now quiet and still, the only sound the distant, fading echoes of the whispers that had filled the air. The sky above was once again dark and foreboding, the stars flickering with an eerie, ghostly light. The forest had returned to its oppressive, twilight state, the shadows and mist lingering in the aftermath of the convergence. Lara stood alone in the silence, her mind reeling from the experience. The journey had come full circle. The dark forces she had encountered now converged into a single, unified presence. The labyrinth, the shrine, and the monolith had all been part of a greater, interconnected reality, a dark and mysterious realm that defied comprehension. With a sense of both relief and resolve, Lara began her journey back through the forest. The path was once again clear, the shifting shadows and mist now a familiar presence. The whispers in the air had faded, leaving behind a profound sense of quiet and stillness. As she walked, Lara reflected on the journey she had undertaken. The labyrinthine paths, the ancient artifacts, and the dark forces she had encountered. The experience had been both harrowing and enlightening, a profound exploration of the unknown. The forest stretched out before her, its dark, enigmatic beauty a reminder of the mysteries that lay beyond. With a sense of determination, Lara continued her journey, ready to face whatever challenges and revelations awaited her. The convergence of the dark forces had marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, a new journey into the heart of the unknown.